Hi everyone. So today I'm going to talk to you about ideal quasi-realism and the revised relativism objection. Um, I defend ideal quasi-realism, and the revised relativism objection is a structural objection which attacks quasi-realism, and I came up with it about a year or two ago. This talk is a small section from a much larger paper, but I would very much value comments and suggestions, and particularly objections would be quite good for the last edit of the paper. Um, so first I'm going to explain what quasi-realism is, just so we're all on the same page, and then I'm going to talk about quasi-realism and relativism and why they're incompatible. And then I'm going to introduce the revised relativism objection. I'm then going to explain what ideal quasi-realism is, so for example, how it differs from Simon Blackburn's quasi-realism. And then finally, I'm going to suggest how ideal quasi-realism can help solve the revised relativism objection. So what is quasi-realism? Well, it's a philosophical program which aims to explain and justify our realist-sounding discourse. And there are particular features that we assume to be part of realist sounding discourse, like moral authority, moral truth, and so on. I'm going to be concentrating on one particular feature, which I've called better, and that's the notion that a judgment can be better than another. That is, that not all of our moral judgments are on a par, they're not all on equal footing. Some of them can be more worthy, so to speak, than others. Quasi-realism achieves its aim via the use of an anti-realist theory, and it's the anti-realist theory that ends up explaining these particular realist-sounding features, like better. Different quasi-realists will use different anti-realist theories to achieve their goals. So Blackburn uses projectivist expressivism, whereas Gibbard uses plan expressivism. I use a type of idealized projectivism, hence the name ideal quasi-realism, and I'll talk about that near the end. So why should relativism trouble the quasi-realist? Well, quasi-realism and relativism are incompatible. You can't explain and justify moral discourse which has features like better and also accept a relativist claim about moral discourse. So, for example, quasi-realism is incompatible with what I call broad equality relativism claims, like all judgments are as good as one another. And you can clearly see the tension between better and that claim. You just can't have both. Given that the quasi-realist is meant to explain features like better, it can't have a certain type of relativist claim underneath all of its anti-realism. So I think that responses to the relativists so far aren't successful. They at the very least need to say a little bit more. And I think that the relativist can still press her skeptical questions in the form of what I've called the revised relativism objection. So the revised relativist demands a meta-ethical explanation of features of moral discourse like better. They don't want a first-order explanation of something like better. That is, they don't just want moral judgments explaining moral judgments. The revised relativist says that if the quasi-realist fails to give such an explanation, then there's an explanatory gap in their account, and this is a disadvantage. So what entitles the revised relativist to give such a demand? Well, it's because the quasi-realist has the particular aim that we just looked at. It has the aim to explain and justify our realist-sounding moral discourse. Quasi-realism, the revised relativist claims, has a direction of fit. So the quasi-realist uses, and I'm just using Blackburn as an example, but you can change up the anti-realist theory if you want to. So the quasi-realist uses her projectivism to explain moral discourse, not the other way around. It cannot be that the discourse itself explains and justifies itself. Since it's the meta-ethics or the meta-ethical theory, which explains and justifies the first-order ethics, then we should expect a meta-ethical solution to something like the revised relativism objection. The quasi-realist can't respond to a relativism objection with a first-order explanation because first-order discourse is the very thing the quasi-realist is trying to explain and justify. If I'm right about this direction of fit, then the quasi-realist has a constraint in her account and the explanations that she can give about moral discourse. If better is explained via moral judgments, then this isn't good enough. The problem for the revised relativism objection remains. The revised relativist can still demand a meta-ethical explanation for better. Further, it starts to look like if we use moral judgments to explain moral judgments, then this just might go on ad infinitum. The suggestion that we can explain better in terms of certain judgments being more or less open to information or more or less biased and so on encounters the problem of generality. Not all cases of moral disagreement are clear-cut. Most moral disagreements are actually very nuanced. It's not obvious which one is correct. Both parties might be well informed. Both parties might be open to new information, have good critical skills, and so on. So in terms of moral disagreement, we end up wondering, well, how can we explain better in those cases? If openness to information and similar processes of judgment are the bases for claiming one judgment is better than another, then in those cases where both parties have equal processes of judgment, we can't really say that one judgment is better than another, and then we end up looking like all judgments are on a par. So how might someone respond to the revised relativism objection? Well, someone might suggest that we should deny the direction of fit claim, and this makes sense as a target for an objection, right? The whole revised relativism objection rests on this claim working. So the revised relativism objection assumes that there's a clear-cut nature between metaethics and ethics. Revised relativists assume that the metaethical always explains and justifies the ethical, at least for the quasi-realist. But the quasi-realist can deny this assumption, so she can just say, well, there's no clear-cut direction of fit. She can give a few examples. She can say, well, first-order level judgments inform meta-ethical judgments. New information can lead to improved attitudes. You can adopt new improved processes of thinking, and so on and so on. And so it doesn't seem obvious that there is a clear-cut distinction anymore. So when the quasi-realist claims that one moral judgment is better in terms of further moral judgments or further first-order judgments, like misogyny is bad, she can then just give that a meta-ethical treatment of the claim. Does this reply work? Well, no. I think the reply misfires, and I think it misfires for two reasons. Even if the first order can inform the meta-ethical, the interaction is only informative, whereas the interaction from the meta-ethical to the ethical is explanatory and justificatory. So there are two separate important interactions going on here, and the relativist is thinking about the second, not the first. Further, the revised relativist is asking for a meta-ethical explanation. If a quasi-realist suggests that judgments being worse or better are still accommodated by first-order discourse, which can nevertheless be given a meta-ethical treatment, it still puts the priority on the first-order discourse. So on this type of reply, justification for first-order talk would still come from first-order talk. So here's a problem. A first-order justification glosses over the distinction between informative interaction and explanatory interaction. And so even if only that problem goes through, it looks like even if the direction of fit claim wobbles, it's still very much there, and it's still something that the quasi-realist can't deny. So what can the ideal quasi-realist say in response to the revised relativist? Well, first we need to look at what ideal quasi-realism is, and if anyone has any questions about this, I've written about this in much, much more detail, so please do ask me and email me questions and so on. So, ideal quasi-realism, on my account, the expression of a stable moral attitude, so that's just something that Blackburn would call a value. Um, it's a stable moral attitude is an expression of approval of a match. Now, what does this mean? Approval of a match. Well, on my view, stability is a combination of just regular you approving of X, ideal you also approving of X. And because you both approve of X, that is a match, or to have a kind of Stevenson atmosphere about this, that's an agreement in attitude. You both approve of X. You also approve of the match between you and ideal you. You approve of ideal you as well, because she has full information and no bias. She's also impartial, and yet aware of interests and the needs of others. And so a match between the two of you both approving of X, is, I argue, obviously not today, but elsewhere, is enough to have a normative force. And this normative force drives you to continue to adopt a positive attitude towards X. So note that what's going on here isn't just approval towards an ideal advisor. It's approval of the match itself. And importantly, ideal you is not godlike. They're simply you plus. They're the best version of you in terms of access to information and impartiality. So how on earth does this type of account help with the revised relativism objection? Well, the ideal quasi-realist says that to solve the problem, the quasi-realist needs to change how we explain better. We need to prioritize the meta-ethical explanation, which is one of the things that the revised relativist demands of the quasi-realist, over first-order explanations. So even if the quasi-realist suggests that better can be accommodated by first-order discourse, which is attached to a meta-ethical explanation, it still puts the priority on first-order discourse, remember. So that's not quite good enough. Ultimately, what we need to do is look at the meta-ethics and give a more robust meta-ethical explanation of better and put the priority for that explanation there. So the ideal quasi-realist still allows for first-order interaction. She doesn't deny that that could happen. For example, she allows that new information can lead to improved judgment. But it's not in virtue of being open to new information that better is explained to the ideal quasi-realist. Rather, better, the idea that one judgment can be better than another, is explained via her meta-ethics. And the ideal quasi-realist gives this explanation of better in terms of stable moral attitudes, which is what we just looked at. So how does this work? I'm going to end on this slide, but if you do have questions, please let me know. Well, regular you and ideal you both have processes of improving your judgment. For example, you both allow new information to inform your judgment. Ideal you does it better than you, but you both have these processes. And suppose that you're in agreement regarding X. You both approve of X. You also approve of ideal you, and there's a match or an agreement between you about approval of X. On, say, Blackburn's quasi-realist account, better, the idea that one judgment can be better than another, seems to be explained by the first point. It seems to be explained by the processes of improving your judgments, or by moral judgments themselves. But according to the ideal quasi-realist, better is explained via the last point, that you approve of ideal you, and there's a match between both of your approvals of X. What this does is it says that better is explained in terms of the match, and so better is explained in terms of the metaethics rather than in terms of the first order talk. So I think that the above explanation or the previous explanation allows for the first order still being informative, allows for lots of the different tricks like the expressivist maneuver and so on that the other quasi-realists subscribe to, but it places the justification explanation of better on the meta-ethics rather than just on first order processes or on moral judgments.